Hello, everyone. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to present my thoughts on this constellation of topics in Ricoeur's work. Today, I want to talk about the shame of Cain, rethinking the significance of Cain and Abel, violence, love your enemies, and forgiveness in Ricoeur. By way of context, I want to say that I've just finished a chapter for Joseph Edelheitz and Jim Moore's book on Ricoeur in Scripture. In that chapter, I looked at another constellation of perspectives. First, comparing Jesus' parable of the lost son with the Cain and Abel narrative. Then, looking at those in the context of what Ricoeur has to say about suicide being something of the paradigmatic death. And finally, considering his relationship with Olivier, because Ricoeur was what we thanatologists call a suicide survivor. My premise was that his personal life influenced his philosophical thinking. Two aspects of what I did there are relevant to what I will say here. First, for that article, I bracketed out the problem of evil in Ricoeur. I did that in order to maintain a focus on the father and son relationship, into which I claimed evil itself did not enter. The other concept I stressed was that of shame. I claimed that much of Ricoeur can better be understood in terms of shame rather than guilt. This is to say, shame identifies that fault which is intrinsic to the self, whereas guilt speaks to the consequences of one's faulted actions. There are many reasons why Ricoeur chose to focus on actions, not the least of which have to do with his thinking about ethics. At the same time, his focus on actions and their consequent guilt leads to certain dead ends, not least of which occur in the problematics of forgiveness as an exchange. Here, I want to speak to what I chose not to address in the context of considering the parable of the lost son. The shift in focus here will be from the relative intimacy of father-son relationships to the socio-political problematics and the existential challenges of shame in those broader contexts. One way those challenges present themselves is in terms of violence, and from that, by extension, to the age-old problem of evil. I want to stress that this disentangling of the personal from the political and guilt from shame is very difficult because of how Ricoeur has construed them together. For example, in Memory, History, Forgetting, Ricoeur articulates the odyssey of the spirit of forgiveness. This leads him to the stage of exchange, where he discusses what he calls historical guilt. He wrestles with how the capacity of a speech act for forgiveness, which might well function efficaciously in interpersonal relationships, might also obtain when it comes to institutions, although, as Ricoeur admits, institutions have no moral conscience. It is here that Ricoeur appeals to Luke 6:32, where he finds what he quotes as the radical commandment to love our enemies unconditionally. However, as Ricoeur also admits, we must reckon with the fact that the enemy has not asked for forgiveness. Instead, he must be loved as he is. The cul-de-sac of this line of reasoning is that such forgiveness as a remediation for historical guilt does not actually entail an exchange. Forgiveness becomes a one-sided gesture, not likely to result in the mutuality of reconciliation that the exchange process of forgiveness is designed to bring about. Another way in which Ricoeur mixes one level of analysis with another is when, joining with Levinas, he refers to what he calls the founding paradigm of the murder of Abel by his brother Cain to exemplify how suicide, as murder turned against oneself teaches that every death is a sort of murder. We can see here a convergence of two lines of thought. On the one hand, a scriptural narrative about fratricide, and on the other hand, what is perhaps a personal grappling with the suicide of his own son. When this leads to, quote, perhaps every death is a sort of murder, it grants to a natural process an intentionality in the personification of death that is inappropriate. To repeat, when Ricoeur pursues the exchange of forgiveness at that level of institutions, he intends to bring about a social process for reconciliation through a consideration addressed to another's dignity. On the one hand, at some level, as he appeals to Arendt, Ricoeur realizes that the institutional forgiveness is a failed project. As he says, there is no politics of forgiveness. However, on the other hand, his recognition that the dignity of the enemy is at stake takes us from the logical sequences of guilt to those of shame. While it may be that the ideal process of forgiveness exchange does protect the dignity of the enemy, two factors weigh against that. For one, the enemy must confess, must ask for forgiveness, and risk that forgiveness might be withheld. The enemy is justified in anticipating that this will be a humiliating process, which is to underscore that the enemy's dignity is at risk at the outset of the exchange of forgiveness. Moreover, what makes for enmity between two parties is hostility. From that hostility comes violence. This takes us back to the Cain and Abel narrative, but not on Ricoeur's terms. The story is less the paradigm of murder than a paradigm for how shame enters into the mutuality of being human, and in that way, how violence, especially violence that leads to a loss of life, shapes the human condition. I would even say how violence misshapes the human condition. To pick up on Ricoeur's recognition of how dignity is at stake in the socio-political process of forgiveness, we could turn to Martha Nussbaum. She might contribute to our considerations. She wrestled similarly with this dilemma in her Anger and Forgiveness, Resentment, Generosity, Justice, all without once mentioning Ricoeur. This is because while Nussbaum takes anger into account, Ricoeur does not. Nussbaum explores how forgiveness, as an exchange that is fundamentally hierarchical, requires one side to be humble, that is, self-humiliating, to ask without requiring the other to respond positively. The requirement, explicit or implicit, more often provokes anger and instigates vengeance. Of course, if vengeance, then the perpetuation of violence. Lex talionis. That is, Nussbaum realizes that, at the social and political level, Ricoeur's advocacy of forgiveness might bring about the opposite of the consequences he intends. For me, this is one consequence of Ricoeur's focus on guilt and his ignoring the importance of shame. However, before we can go on, we have to take yet another step back. We do well to recognize that neither Ricoeur nor Nussbaum, for that matter, realize the significance of shame in human interactions. Some perspectives on shame are in order. We would benefit from adding a third perspective to the two most common ways psychologists have construed shame. On the one hand, as exposure, as in Erikson's Childhood and Society, and on the other as affect, as in Nathanson's Shame and Pride. That third perspective, surprisingly, comes from aesthetics. Frederick Turner provides this third view in his Beauty, the Value of Values. Turner's point is based on what he recognizes to be, quote, the foundation myths of any culture where we find some deeply shameful act as the origin of the human world. Shame, he says, does not come from a lack of ability to have or possess. It comes from the consciousness of a lack of ability to give. Shame derives basically from a suspicion that our own gift to society was not acceptable, and thus our exclusion from the human exchange system may, shamefully, be justified. This, he says, is the shame of Cain. It is from this point of Turner's perspective that we can turn to the paradigm of the Cain and Abel story. We depart from Ricoeur's use of that narrative to link suicide and murder. Instead, we turn to use Turner's take to exemplify how it is that shame takes us beyond systems of human exchange, indeed beyond actions and behavior, toward an exposure and realization of what is at the core of human being. From the Cain and Abel narrative, we can travel to the command that we love our enemies. We can begin by asking ourselves, what is it that makes shame an important element in our being challenged by Scripture to love our enemies? We will want first of all to notice that this command to love our enemies has about it an entirely different aim than the one to love our neighbors as ourselves. About the latter, there is at least some presumption of benevolence. With our neighbors, we might presume to be, at the very least, getting along. In oneself as another, Ricoeur builds upon Hillel to support the Golden Rule. When it comes to loving our enemies, the Golden Rule is not possible. As I said, one must instead presume hostility, and if hostility, then violence. If not directly, then at least in the form of ill will. Ricoeur recognized this, of course, but less in memory, history, forgetting than in oneself as another. There, Ricoeur is clear about both the politics of violence and the violence of politics. Moreover, he is explicit regarding the evil of violence in torture, abuse, and the like. My opinion is that Ricoeur's discussion is conceptually consistent, if, for that, rather emotionally eviscerated. He says, violence is equivalent to the diminishment or the destruction of the power to do of others. But he does see that torture entails the systematic effort to destroy the self-esteem of the other. This destruction is, for Ricoeur, the essence of humiliation. What is called humiliation, he says, is nothing else than the destruction of self-respect. Here we seem to have reached the depths of evil, he concludes. To underscore my point, Ricoeur here is clearly in the realm of shame. This is one way, via the shame lexicon, to get back to evil from violence and the self-enemy relationship. Similarly, in Memory, History, Forgetting, Ricoeur underscores the role of shame in the origin of human violence. Our vulnerability to shame, beyond our capacity to act badly, transfuses human relationships and is integral to the malevolence we show one another. Shame becomes an invitation. As Ricoeur has said, over and beyond the will to make others suffer and to eliminate them, indeed stands the will to humiliate, to deliver the other over to the neglect of abandonment, of self-loathing. All these categories and terms, humiliation, dignity, indignity, self-respect and self-esteem, betrayal, are not merely references to a typology of wrong, to use Ricoeur's words. They are terms in the lexicon of shame. That is, in order to appreciate what is at stake in our loving our enemies, we will need to employ the terminology of shame and understand how shame functions in our enemy relationships. In short, we will need to take shame into account if we are to appreciate the social, institutional, and historical significance of violence that Ricoeur was trying to get at and ameliorate or heal through the mechanism ritual of the exchange of forgiveness. To do this, let's return to Turner's take of the Cain and Abel story so that we can see there how shame leads to violence and murder. Turner is right to underscore that Cain has nothing left to give. But we must not miss the point that Cain has experienced rejection and the humiliation of having his gift rejected by God. That is, he is bereft and humiliated. He is experiencing shame. What Turner's perspective helps us see is that the experience of shame becomes the motivation for lethal violence. Shame instigates the violence in the biblical narrative. We have seen that Ricoeur recognizes the role of the dignity dynamic in forgiveness and the role of humiliation in violence and evil. He does this in general in oneself as another. In Memory, History, Forgetting, he expands on this in terms of genocide and the Holocaust. In Living Up to Death, while considering Jorge Semprun's writing, he notes that the conflicted silence of the Holocaust survivors is something they share. That is because shame silences. What Ricoeur misses is, why would we love our enemies? Indeed, why should we love our enemies? After all, by definition, our enemies are hostile to us. By all accounts, our enemies do not want to be loved by us. And in fact, there are existential aspects of our enemies that would refuse our loving them. Let me just name two. On the one hand, there are cultures and subcultures around the world whose cohesion is maintained by shame. Our name for them is honor cultures. For those in an honor culture, loyalty is paramount and forgiveness is forbidden. It is not possible. Instead, offense provokes vengeance. One's honor and the honor of one's family, even the honor of one's vocation, is defended and maintained by violence. As it happens, Abel's having been a herder meant that he was a member of that kind of honor culture. Although Cain was a farmer, when he killed Abel, he entered into the cycle of violence of the herder's honor culture. His life was in danger. Other herders would be compelled to kill him. God's mark protected him. But there is no forgiveness in that story. No love of enemies. There is only the recognition that that is how things are. Reality. If honor cultures are shame-driven, evil is perpetuated by those who are shameless, those who have no sense of shame themselves. This can be individual persons, for instance, serial killers, or it can be whole societies. The Nazis were shameless, hence the Shoah. Pol Pot was shameless, hence the killing fields. Genocide, wherever and whenever it occurs, for example, the genocide of native peoples by those who, quote-unquote, settled the United States, happens because of shamelessness. Slavery is rooted in shamelessness. All evil is shameless, and shamelessness is the root of all evil. With that in mind, how does one love one's enemies? How do we love those who are shame-bound, as in honor cultures? How do we love those whose shamelessness prompts them from them the kind of violence and evil that Ricoeur wrote about, those with a will to humiliate? I want to respond with what might seem to be a series of outrageous or maybe even irrational claims. I say that because I want to begin suggesting that when Jesus commanded we love our enemies, he did not have in mind our enemies' benefit. He had in mind our own. I say that because the capacity to feel shame is, or can be, a positive aspect of one's character. I've claimed that a lack of a capacity for shame leads to a penchant for violence and evil, and in that, the power over to take advantage of another's capacity for shame by humiliation and torture. On the other hand, Evelyn and James Whitehead, in their Transforming Our Painful Emotions, speak about a healthy shame that can keep us humble. They tell the story of Russian dissident Natan Sharansky's response to the humiliations of interrogation by the KGB. Sharansky wrote, "Nothing they do can humiliate me. I alone can humiliate myself." The Whitehead's point is that healthy shame can counteract the will to humiliate of our enemies. In this way, to love one's enemies is not to allow oneself to be reduced and robbed of one's own dignity. A similar story is told by Kurtz and Ketchum in their book, The Spirituality of Imperfection. As that story goes, during the atrocities that accompanied the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, thousands of bewildered suspects were randomly arrested, rounded up, stripped naked, and shot one by one in the back of the head. However, most of the victims usually requested a chance to say goodbye, and because there was no one else, they embraced and kissed their executioners. What is ontologically problematic is when we are numbed to our own sense of shame, for then we are desensitized to the very affect that both makes us human and connects us to other human beings. When we are shameless, we are dehumanized, and we perpetuate dehumanizing indignities upon others. This dehumanization is precisely what occurs in the enemy relationship. What is important to note is that it is mutual. That is, what dehumanizes the other also dehumanizes me. This is what makes loving our enemies the antidote to the shamelessness pervasive in the enemy relationship. The capacity to love one's enemies is a kind of affirmation and a kind of refusal. The affirmation is of one's own dignity in the face of the humiliations of the enemy. And the refusal is to forget the humanity of the other as enemy, even in the midst of hostility. Ironically, loving one's enemies can even maintain a degree of mutuality and reciprocity in a situation in which our enemies are determined to deny and eliminate both. Loving one's enemies is possible if one develops a healthy sense of shame. To underscore, while guilt may be an ethical concept, shame is an ontological one, and as such, while guilt may be one-sided on the part of the bad actor, shame is shared. Shame at least has a potential for mutuality. Shame holds out the proposition that what is ontologically true for me is ontologically true for my enemy. In a way that is perhaps ironic, by seizing on the benefits of a healthy shame, we can better understand Ricoeur's dictum. In Oneself as Another, he writes, "Because there is evil, the aim of the good life has to be submitted to the test of moral obligation, which can be described in the following terms. Act solely in accordance with the maxim by which you can wish at the same time that what ought not to be, namely evil, will indeed not exist." None of this happens because the exchange of forgiveness is well practiced. It could, however, be possible if we were to develop a healthy shame in a way both to ensure that institutions remain just and to counteract them when they are not. In this way, of course, Our love of enemies is based less on trust, because the shameless can only be trusted to be violent, than it would be on hope. The hope of a culturalization, maybe, in a way. Certainly a hope that the violent reactivity decreases when not responded to with vengeance. A hope that when we respond with humility instead of humiliation, and with honor to hostility, we might break the cycle of violence that can spiral into outbreaks of evil. In conclusion, I want to say this is not a how-to presentation, but it is meant to be a phenomenological description of what we are facing when we aspire to be obedient to the Lucan commandment. And it is meant to describe why addressing evil and violence with forgiveness can result in a kind of sophisticated naivete. If we recognize that not guilt, but shame is at the core of the injuries the violence has committed, then we might come to a second naivete and hope for a more thoroughgoing transformation of our culture. In the spirit of Ricoeur's ending Memory, History, Forgetting, by appealing to hymnody, I would say, or even sing, let it begin with me. Let it begin with each of us. Thank you.